Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the place where we take massive stacks of sources and turn them into instant, well-contextualized expertise. Today, we are opening the vault on one of history's most fascinating and notoriously slippery characters. A failed businessman, a convicted criminal, a double agent, and somehow the unlikely father of the English novel.
We're moving far beyond the stereotype of the desert island author. Of course, the anchor point is Daniel Defoe, the man who gave us Robinson Crusoe in 1719.
Yeah.
And that's a book of such monumental influence that,
Yeah.
our sources confirm it's allegedly the second most translated book globally, right after the Bible.
And that's where most people stop, isn't it? If you only know the man who wrote Crusoe, you are missing the man who invented himself. Because the deeper we dig into the material, the more we realize Defoe was an English writer, yes, but also a political operative, a revolutionary, a bankrupt merchant,
The spy.
and a spy who was constantly in motion, often running for his life.
The sheer output is staggering. He penned well over 300 published works, and some scholars, like J.R. Moore, they push that total up to something like 545 attributed titles.
Wow.
That's just a staggering mountain of content, covering everything from political polemics and economic theory to manuals on marriage and eventually this groundbreaking fiction.
What's central to the story we're about to unpack here is the constant, almost frightening tension in his life. He was a brilliant intellectual, a pioneer of modern journalism and economic thought, yet he was perpetually navigating disaster. I mean, he spent time in prison, he stood in the public pillory.
And he ended his life potentially hiding from creditors. The highs were monumental, but the lows were, well, they were existential.
It creates this fascinating contradiction, right?
It really does. He was the ultimate insider, advising kings and shaping national policy. Yet he was always an outsider because of his religion, because of his debt, and his willingness to constantly switch loyalties just to survive.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's trace the path of Daniel Foe, that was his original name, to the celebrated, slightly fraudulent, high society-sounding Daniel Defoe. We want to understand how this relentlessly volatile life became the training ground for the realistic novel itself.
So we have to begin with Daniel Foe. Born around 1660 near Fore Street in London, his father, James Foe, was a successful tradesman, a prosperous tallow chandler.
A tallow chandler, which is, what exactly? A candle maker.
A person who makes and sells candles and soaps, yeah. Importantly, he was also a member of the Worshipful Company of Butchers, one of the powerful London trade guilds. So that points to his solid, respectable middle-class background.
But respectable wasn't enough for Daniel, was it? We see this early sign of ambition, the name change. He adds the D to become Defoe. It's such an overt piece of personal branding.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
He added that aristocratic-sounding prefix D much later in life, trying to elevate himself socially and politically. The material even suggests he occasionally spread this false claim that he was descended from a Norman family called de Beaufort. It was a conscious effort to adopt a better pedigree than the one his father's soap-making provided.
But there might have been a tiny kernel of truth in the change.
Potentially.
Mm-hmm.
The sources do note that the prefix de is quite common in Flemish surnames. And given that his father likely had some Flemish descent, it wasn't a complete invention. It was more of a strategic enhancement, you could say, capitalizing on a subtle, foreign, maybe noble association. It really set the stage for a life of constant self-reinvention.
What's extraordinary, though, is how immediately that promising start was tested by these monumental historical forces. He was born into an era of almost unimaginable trauma.
His early childhood reads like a historical horror novel. He was born around 1660. 5 years later, in 1665, comes the Great Plague of London. 70,000 people died. That was a quarter of London's population at the time.
I can't even imagine the psychological imprint that leaves on a 5-year-old. And that chaos was only getting started.
The very next year, 1666, brought the Great Fire of London. And this wasn't just a large fire. It virtually incinerated the ancient city. The sources note that only Defoe's house and 2 others in his entire neighborhood were left standing.
That's unbelievable, a child witnessing total destruction outside his door, but his own home survives. That must have instilled a profound sense of just how precarious life is.
Precisely. So his first 6 years were defined by pestilence and fire. But the historical assault just continued.
Right.
A year after the fire, in 1667, England suffered this catastrophic national humiliation, the Dutch raid on the Medway. The Dutch fleet sailed right up the River Thames and attacked Chatham, burning warships, seizing the flagship. Defoe was 7 years old.
Pestilence, fire, foreign invasion, all before the age of 8. It's no wonder he later became such an obsessive observer, a chronicler of his society. He was always looking for patterns and ways to survive chaos. He became the voice of the striving, meticulous survivor in Robinson Crusoe because he learned those survival lessons early.
That trauma absolutely explains his later focus on survival, on inventory, on the meticulous accounting of both material and spiritual goods. And finally, the last key to his early life is his unique education. His parents were Presbyterian dissenters.
Meaning they refused to conform to the established Church of England, which led to, well, to government persecution.
Right. And it also meant he was locked out of a traditional education, like Oxford or Cambridge.
So where did he go?
He was sent instead to a dissenting academy, specifically one run by a man named Charles Morton in Newington Green. And this was a critical divergence. Traditional universities were focused on classical learning, preparing young men for the clergy. Dissenting academies, on the other hand, offered a much more modern, practical curriculum. They focused on subjects like mathematics, business management, and modern languages, exactly what a future merchant and political operative would need.
So that practical education really sets the stage for the next volatile phase, his commercial life, the one where he aimed so high but just repeatedly crashed.
Defoe was deeply ambitious. He launched himself into business as a general merchant, and he was trading aggressively. The sources detail his dealings in hosiery, woolen goods, tobacco, wine. He was the embodiment of the early modern capitalist, just seeing opportunity everywhere.
And his ambitions went far beyond simple trade. He was pursuing projects that felt almost fantastical.
Exactly. He bought a country estate, he purchased a ship, and perhaps most bizarrely, he tried to set up a perfume business by importing civet cats.
A very high-risk, high-reward venture that depended entirely on fickle luxury trends. This shows not just ambition, but a profound and ultimately ruinous risk tolerance. He didn't start from nothing, though. He received a substantial capital injection when he got married, right? To marry toughly.
He did. When they married in 1684, she brought a dowry of 3,700 pounds.
Which, for context, was a fortune.
An enormous sum. A prosperous London merchant might live comfortably on a few £100s a year. Defoe started with a war chest that should have ensured lifelong stability.
And yet, despite that massive starting capital, the financial reality for him was just constant chaos.
He was chronically indebted. The sources paint a pretty dismal picture. By 1692, he was arrested for debts of £700, but his total liabilities across all his failed ventures, they may have been as high as £17,000.
£17,000.
It forced him to declare bankruptcy. The scale of his failure was spectacular. It absolutely destroyed his reputation for years.
So was he simply a terrible businessman, or was his ambition so wildly ahead of 18th century finance that failure was just inevitable?
It seems to be a combination of both. He was always chasing the next big project, the spring, not the pond, as he would later write.
Right.
But he never mastered the necessary caution or diversification. His failure led to this constant, desperate game of recovery. He was arrested, imprisoned, and even after his release, he was constantly running. He traveled to Europe, trading wine in places like Cadiz, Porto, and Lisbon, essentially trying to outrun his creditors and rebuild his fortune on the fly.
That constant, immediate threat of financial ruin must have been a powerful motivator for his political and literary life. The pen became his new and ultimately more successful trade.
It became his lifeline, absolutely. But before he mastered the pen, he tried direct political action. In 1685, he committed what might have been his single most dangerous career move by joining the Monmouth Rebellion.
That was the Protestant attempt to overthrow the Catholic King James II. If it failed, the penalty was treason and death.
And it did fail, spectacularly. It led to the brutal crackdown known as the Bloody Assizes under Judge George Jeffreys. Yet, through what must have been sheer luck or incredible political maneuvering, Defoe secured a pardon and escaped the mass executions. This moment really established a pattern for him, surviving existential threats through rapid political realignment.
Which he immediately capitalized on.
When William III and Mary were crowned in 1689, Defoe pivoted instantly. He became a close ally and a secret agent for the new king. He went from a pardoned, failed rebel to working directly for the crown's intelligence apparatus.
A phenomenal pivot. But even after the king's death, when he was still struggling to pay off debts, he tried for bureaucratic stability again, didn't he?
Yes. Between all the political writing and the commercial schemes, he took a very stable job as a commissioner of the glass duty around 1695, basically a tax collector. Then he ran a tile and brick factory in Essex in 1696. He was always trying to find a stable, legitimate footing, but his debt and his radical political views always seemed to pull him back into the chaos.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting. Because when his commercial life failed and when tax collecting proved too dull, his writing became his currency, but also his downfall.
The sheer volume of his output is astounding and reflects his need to constantly earn money and influence events. Our sources show his pen tackled everything from tracts on crime and marriage to detailed political theory. He was a professional writer in an age that was just beginning to recognize the profession.
He started out with a great political success, though, defending the king he served.
That was the true-born Englishman in 1701. King William III was Dutch, and he faced constant, ugly, xenophobic attacks from his political enemies and from the populace. Defoe used his poem to argue that pure Englishness was a myth, that the nation was a hybrid, a mongrel race, strengthened by immigration and trade.
That's a surprisingly modern and progressive argument for the early 18th century.
It was wildly successful and politically very timely. It includes an incredibly profound couplet about the persistence of vice. Wherever God erects a house of prayer, the devil always builds a chapel there. It's a great example of his ability to weave sharp social insight into political necessity.
But the political climate shifted violently when Queen Anne took the throne in 1702.
Absolutely. Anne was hostile to nonconformists, pushing aggressively for the Anglican Church's dominance. Defoe, as a lifelong dissenter, was immediately defensive, so he decided to employ his most dangerous weapon, satire. This led to the infamous pamphlet, The Shortest Way with the Dissenters, published anonymously in December 1702.
This is a masterclass in political trolling, but it backfired catastrophically.
The pamphlet was a piece of extreme layered satire. It purported to be written by an extreme high church Tory, arguing that the only way to secure the Church of England was through the outright extermination of the dissenters.
So he was mocking the extremist zealots by adopting their most frightening possible stance.
Yes, but he was also satirizing the hypocrites on his own side, the dissenters who practiced what was called occasional conformity.
Right. Can you unpack that for us? What was that?
Occasional conformity was a cynical practice where dissenters would attend Anglican services just enough times a year to legally qualify for public office. It was a way to bypass discriminatory laws without genuinely conforming. And Defoe saw this as a moral and spiritual failure.
So he wrote something so convincing and so extreme that people on both sides took it seriously. The Tories initially praised it, while the dissenters completely panicked.
That's how powerful and deceptive the writing was. But once the true identity of the author was discovered, Daniel Defoe, the known dissenter, the outrage was explosive. He was immediately arrested for seditious libel.
And the political establishment decided to make an example of him.
They did. The trial was held at the Old Bailey in front of Judge Salathiel Lovell, who was notoriously harsh. The sentence was designed to crush him utterly. A punitive fine of 200 marks, which, for context, was equivalent to about $71,883 in today's money. It was financial annihilation.
And that wasn't even the worst part.
No. On top of the fine, he was sentenced to stand in the public pillory for 3 days, followed by an indeterminate length of imprisonment in Newgate until that massive fine was paid. The pillory was a tool of public shaming and violence. People often threw stones, excrement, rotten food. It could easily result in severe injury or death.
That sentence alone would have destroyed 99% of people. The fact that he emerged from the pillory and immediately started pioneering modern journalism, it speaks to an almost frightening drive to survive.
His survival instinct was legendary. While he was awaiting his fate in Newgate, he composed the hymn to the pillory. The famous legend is that when he stood in the pillory on July 31st, 1703, the crowd, moved by his poem, threw flowers and drank to his health, transforming the intended humiliation into a public celebration.
Now, some scholars do question the extent of the flower throwing, but the resilience is undeniable. The great Defoe biographer, John Robert Moore, noted how unique the event was. He said, "No man in England but Defoe ever stood in the pillory and later rose to eminence among his fellow men."
That moment saved him reputationally, but it didn't solve the problem of Newgate prison or the massive debt. His way out was brokered by the very political faction he had just mocked.
Wait, this sounds less like political agility and more like cynical opportunism. He went to work for the people who put him in the pillory. How did he rationalize that?
The material suggests that pragmatism just won out over ideology. Robert Harley, the first Earl of Oxford, was the leading minister and spy master for the Tories, the party of the High Church. He needed a brilliant political writer. So Harley brokered Defoe's release, paid off some of his most pressing debts, and in exchange, Defoe became his intelligence agent, working for the Tory administration.
The bankrupt dissenter turned public spectacle immediately turned spy for the rival government. That is the definition of a necessary moral compromise to survive.
He had learned that survival required absolute flexibility, and he immediately proved his worth, not just as a covert operative, but as a groundbreaking writer. Within days of his release from Newgate in late 1703, Defoe witnessed one of the worst natural disasters in British history, the Great Storm of 1703. It caused catastrophic damage, killed thousands, and was treated almost as a biblical event.
And he turned this chaos into a pioneering work of nonfiction.
The Storm, published in 1704. He gathered eyewitness accounts, he compiled reports, and he attempted to chronologically sequence and verify the disaster's events. He gave the public a cohesive, factual narrative of a massive event, leading many scholars to regard this as one of the world's first examples of modern journalism. He was synthesizing disparate reports into compelling reality.
That solidifies his role as a reporter. But to be a government spy, he needed a consistent platform to influence public opinion.
That's when he launched his massive political operation, a review of the affairs of France, starting in 1704. It ran 3 times a week without interruption for 9 years. This periodical became the main, trusted mouthpiece for the English government, pushing their political and economic agenda, especially around the War of the Spanish Succession.
And he was the ultimate political chameleon, demonstrating his loyalty only to his paycheck. When Harley was briefly ousted by the Whig Party, Defoe kept the review running, right?
He did. He just supported the new minister, Godolphin, only to switch back to supporting Harley and the Tories when they returned to power. His ability to adopt and abandon positions was unparalleled. Our sources highlight a truly insightful observation he made to Harley about his own operation. Defoe warned the spymaster that he was amazed that Harley left vital state papers just lying around. Defoe, the professional spy, warned his employer that he was practically inviting an unscrupulous clerk to commit treason.
Which was prophetic because that's exactly what happened with the William Gregg affair.
Precisely. And even after the Tories finally fell with the death of Queen Anne, Defoe kept doing intelligence work for the incoming Whig government. He was literally tasked with writing what appeared to be Tory pamphlets, designed to undermine the Tory point of view from the inside by making their positions seem ridiculous.
He was the ultimate double agent, a man with no fixed allegiance except to political and financial self-preservation. This brings us to his most significant intelligence mission, securing the Anglo-Scottish Union of 1707.
This was the major political project of the era. Defoe, leveraging his deep economic knowledge, was put forward to manage the public relations campaign. His review became the engine promoting the necessity of the Union.
What were his arguments to the English establishment for the Union?
He argued it was a utilitarian and strategic necessity. It would end the constant political threat from the North, the possibility of a separate rival nation. Crucially, he argued it would give the Treasury an inexhaustible treasury of men and secure a valuable new market for English goods, massively increasing the power of Great Britain.
So in 1706, he was sent to Edinburgh, directly into the lion's den, to secure what Harley called acquiescence, using underhand methods.
He was sent as a secret agent for Godolphin, and thanks to his detailed and often terrified letters, we have an unparalleled look at an 18th century spy mission.
What was the atmosphere like when he arrived?
It was explosive. The common people in Scotland were deeply resistant to losing their sovereignty, and Defoe's initial reports included vivid, frightening descriptions of the violent demonstrations. He wrote about his fear of being lynched, detailing the crowds surging up the high street shouting, "No Union, no English dogs." His assessment was blunt. A Scots rabble is the worst of its kind.
So how did this English spy, who was hated on sight by the crowds, manage to infiltrate the decision-making process?
He used his identity as a Presbyterian dissenter. In England, he had suffered for his convictions. In Scotland, the Presbyterian clergy saw him as a co-religionist. They accepted him as an advisor to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland and several key committees of the Scottish Parliament.
That placed him perfectly. He was inside the room where the key decisions were being made.
He confessed to Harley that he was privy to all their folly and perfectly unsuspected as with corresponding with anybody in England. This meant he could actively, though secretly, shape the legislation. He boasted about having the good fortune to break their measures in 2 particulars via the bounty on corn and proportion of the excise.
And to contextualize that for you, the bounty on corn was a subsidy for Scottish farmers, and the excise was the tax structure. These were critical issues. So Defoe was literally altering the financial terms of the Union from within the Scottish legislative body.
Exactly. He was editing the treaty process in London's favor. And the propaganda campaign he waged simultaneously was brilliantly deceptive.
You mentioned he used completely contradictory arguments depending on his audience.
For the Scots, he ignored the fundamental English doctrine of the sovereignty of Parliament, telling them they could trust the treaty's guarantees on their laws. Then he used the exact opposite legal logic when writing for an English audience. Even more cunningly, he published pamphlets purporting to be written by Scots defending the Union, which were entirely his own work.
That is astonishing. He actively tried to corrupt the historical record to achieve a short-term political goal.
And he succeeded. He later published The History of the Union of Great Britain in 1709, a massive and seemingly comprehensive volume. Even today, some historians still use it as a valuable contemporary source, despite Defoe's clear bias and his deliberate omissions.
What were the biggest omissions in that so-called history?
He essentially wrote out the main Union opponent, Andrew Fletcher of Salton, by just ignoring him entirely. He also failed to explain the sudden dramatic shift of the official leader of the opposition, the Duke of Hamilton, who unexpectedly switched to the Unionist side at the very end. Defoe gave his history an air of objectivity and finality, but always ensured his side had the last, seemingly impartial word.
Did he ever admit the economic reality of the Union didn't live up to his propaganda?
Much later, in a tour through the whole island of Great Britain in 1726, when he was no longer an active government operative, he made a stunning admission. He confessed that the huge increase of trade and population in Scotland he had so confidently predicted was not the case, but rather the contrary.
So even the great propagandist recognized that economic reality was harsher than his political promises.
And that reality included profound, immediate local unrest, especially in Glasgow or Glasgow. Defoe's description of Glasgow as a dear green place is often cited, though Glasgow probably translates more accurately to green hollow. But regardless of the etymology, the city was a hotbed of anti-union sentiment.
Requiring massive government force to suppress it.
Exactly. Though local clergy were urging congregations to up an event for the city of God, and rioters were tearing up copies of the treaty. Defoe noted that when he revisited Glasgow in the 1720s, the hostility was still palpable, entirely because of the Union, which they were almost universally exclaimed against. The local resistance was persistent and enduring.
This life of constant political maneuvering, debt, and survival, the need to adopt and shed identities, it was the perfect high-pressure environment for his next phase, the sudden and spectacular birth of the English novel.
What's truly remarkable is the timeline. All of his most famous genre-defining novels, Robinson Crusoe, Moll Flanders, Colonel Jack, Roxana, they were published very late in his life. It was between 1719 and about 1724. He was in his late 50s when he finally found the literary form that made him immortal.
Let's start with Robinson Crusoe from 1719. We all know the survival narrative, but what was the deeper Defoe pattern at work there?
Robinson Crusoe is fundamentally a Presbyterian spiritual autobiography, but it's dressed up as an adventure story. The narrative details Crusoe's struggle with faith, his constant bargaining with God when disaster strikes, followed by backsliding once the danger passes. The core message is that he only finds contentment and true prosperity once he achieves a genuine conversion on his isolated island.
It's a powerful narrative of economic reckoning and spiritual accounting, which makes so much sense given Defoe's own history with debt.
It absolutely does. Every inventory Crusoe takes, every meticulous account of his possessions and his time, it all reflects the anxiety of a merchant who has repeatedly failed in the real world. And while it's often linked to the real-life castaway Alexander Selkirk, the novel may also borrow heavily from an earlier Arabic work, Philosophus Autodidactus, by Ibn Tufayl.
A Muslim polymath potentially influencing the most foundational narrative of Christian conversion in English literature. That's a fascinating cross-cultural link.
It highlights Defoe's wide reading and his willingness to steal or synthesize ideas for his own didactic purposes. And in the sequel, The Farther Adventures, he tries desperately to maintain the illusion of truth, describing Crusoe settling in Bedfordshire, implying that Defoe's own family had met Crusoe to gather the information. The deception is central to his craft.
Then we get to Moll Flanders in 1722, a massive shift in social setting and gender roles.
Moll Flanders is a spectacular, picaresque novel about a heroine Moll, who is at different times a whore, a bigamist, and a professional thief. She is entirely driven by economic viability. She manipulates men, she commits crimes, and she strives for material survival, yet Defoe writes her with a narrative voice that somehow manages to retain the reader's sympathy.
Defoe gave us a criminal protagonist whose primary moral compass was economic viability, not traditional virtue. That's why she keeps our sympathy. How revolutionary was that for the 18th century?
Hugely revolutionary. It challenged the conventional 18th century views on femininity, which dictated that a woman must be passively virtuous. Moll is active, resourceful, and ruthless. She finds success through her own cunning. Like Crusoe, she accumulates wealth and finally repents, but her material reward always precedes her spiritual conversion.
He used a similar trajectory with his other major novel of that year, Colonel Jack.
Yes. Colonel Jack follows an orphan from extreme poverty and a life of petty crime in London to prosperity in the colonies. His journey is driven by this flawed, yet quintessentially English, notion of striving to become a gentleman. And he, too, undergoes a religious conversion only after securing his material success. Defoe was clearly mapping out a structure: poverty, crime, material achievement, and then a retrospective spiritual justification.
But his final major novel breaks that mold, which is why it feels more psychologically complex.
Roxana. The Fortunate Mistress from 1724 is the anti-conversion novel. Roxana is a high society courtesan whose story narrates a complete moral and spiritual decline. Unlike Crusoe and Moll, Roxana, despite her claims of penitence at the end, never exhibits a genuine spiritual conversion. Her pursuit of wealth is ruthless and leads only to further moral decline. It's a much darker, more cynical view of human motivation.
And finally, the hybrid work that perfectly embodies his background as a spy and journalist, A Journal of the Plague Year.
This is a masterpiece of realism that deliberately blurs the line between novel and nonfiction. It's an account of the 1665 plague, written as if by an eyewitness, using the initials HF. This was probably a reference to his uncle, Henry Foe. But Daniel Defoe himself was only about 5 years old during the actual event.
Yeah, the detail is so compelling, it reads like a first-hand history.
That's the genius of his research. He meticulously pored through primary sources, parish death registers, historical accounts, government documents, and filtered them through a constructed, plausible, immediate narrative voice. It's historical fiction masquerading as a true memoir. It proves that his experience as a government operative who had to write propaganda that felt absolutely authentic made him the perfect early novelist.
We should briefly mention Captain Singleton from 1720 as well. What stands out about that adventure novel?
Captain Singleton is notable for its incredible geographical detail. The first half covers a traversal of Africa that was so remarkably detailed, it seemed to anticipate discoveries made much later by explorers like David Livingstone. The description of the geography and fauna suggests deep, specific research, far beyond typical 18th century fiction. It also features a sensitive depiction of piracy and the central moralizing relationship between the hero and his Quaker mentor, William Walters. What's fascinating here is how much of Defoe's professional writing wasn't dedicated to swashbuckling or conversion narratives, but to hard economics, business instruction, and national policy.
He was a true pioneer of business literature, making him far more than just a literary figure.
Exactly. The Complete English Tradesman from 1726 is the prime example. It's framed as a conduct manual, offering religious and practical advice for merchants, distilling the lessons, often the hard-won lessons, from his own tumultuous career.
And he used this book to make a profound argument for British economic superiority.
He argued forcefully that the British system was superior to all others because it put trade mercantile capitalism at the center of national life. This is where we get that iconic piece of philosophy, which really underpins modern risk-taking. An estate's a pond, but a trade's a spring.
That distinction is so powerful. An inherited estate is stagnant, finite, it can be drained, but a trade, actively pursued, is an endless source of wealth, creation, and renewal. It elevates the risk-taker.
And that philosophy led directly to his views on social mobility, which resonated deeply with his own journey from a tallow chandler's son. Defoe praised trade explicitly for elevating individuals to the level of gentlemen. He argued that the British gentry was not some pure landowning caste, but was inextricably linked to trade through generations of marriage, genealogy, and commercial investment.
So he was arguing that trade, not land or lineage, was the new engine of national identity.
It was an economic manifesto, masquerading as a manual. Defoe explicitly argued that trade, not war or military conquest, was the superior catalyst for social and economic change. He believed the expansion of the British Empire's mercantile influence would increase commerce at home through job creation and increased consumption.
And how did he connect that growth to lifting the general population out of poverty?
Following the laws of supply and demand, he reasoned that increased consumption necessitated boosted production, which, in turn, raised wages for the poor. He saw trade as the ultimate mechanism for general societal improvement. His ideas feel very much like a pre-Adam Smith blueprint for modern capitalist theory.
He even extended this into sophisticated historical economic analysis, looking backward to justify his contemporary views.
In his Plan of the English Commerce from 1728, he provided a detailed history of the English wool and textile industry. This was a critical sector. He credited the Tudor monarchs, particularly Henry VII and Elizabeth I, for developing the sector using what we now call classic protectionist measures.
Give us an example of that protectionism.
He detailed how the Tudors imposed high tariffs on finished woolen imports from the continent. They placed high taxes on raw English wool leaving the country. They actively brought in skilled artisans. And they even sponsored early forms of industrial espionage to steal foreign manufacturing secrets.
So he was advocating for state-sponsored development and protectionism based on 2 centuries of successful historical precedent. He was synthesizing history, morality, commerce, and national strategy into a cohesive whole, making him a true economic analyst of the first rank. So what does this all mean for a man who wrote so much, worked for so many sides, and used nearly 200 identities? It brings us to the central difficulty facing Defoe scholars, the massive, unstable, and often unknowable canon.
It is an absolute nightmare for attribution. We have to reiterate the astonishing number of pen names he used, at least 198. Anonymity was standard in the 18th century for political survival, but Defoe mastered it because his own survival depended on constantly changing masks based on the political winds and who he was trying to deceive.
And that disguise means we can't definitively say what he wrote even today.
Exactly. If you only count works published under his few known names, you get only about 75 titles. But scholars have vastly divergent lists. George Chalmers first attributed 174 works. William P. Trent pushed that to 370. And the most aggressive tally, compiled by J.R. Moore, attributed approximately 550 works.
550 works. The potential scope of his influence, touching everything from children's manuals to religious tracts and deep politics, is just staggering if that high number is accurate.
And think about the most famous novels. Moll Flanders and Roxana were published anonymously for over 50 years. Publishers only finally put Daniel Defoe on the title pages in the 1770s. The man was so prolific and so adept at disguise that his own enduring literary legacy was fragmented for decades.
When scholars attempt to analyze this vast, messy body of work, what are the core unifying patterns that tell us it's definitively Defoe?
The material identifies 3 key traits seen consistently across his works. First is didacticism, the underlying aim to always convey a moral message or a practical lesson. This stems directly from his deeply ingrained religious dissenting background. Every story is a lesson in spiritual or material survival.
Which flows naturally into the second trait, the spiritual autobiography.
Precisely. We see this most powerfully in Robinson Crusoe, the narrative of the individual's journey toward finding faith through hardship, that moment of individual reckoning with God. Even his criminals, like Moll Flanders, are eventually forced into that individual reckoning.
And finally, the trait that ties his spy work and his journalism directly to his fiction writing.
That is the pattern of claiming truth. Across his fictional works, a common and essential feature is his insistence that they were true stories of their subjects, whether it was an isolated castaway, a career criminal, or an eyewitness to a plague. He was an expert in fictionalizing reality to make it feel absolutely authentic and immediate. The political operative became the novelist by perfecting the art of the convincing lie.
If we connect this all back to the bigger picture, we see a man whose life was defined by extreme instability, from the plague and fire of his childhood to the debtor's prison and the pillory.
His career spanned every major political and social upheaval of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, forcing him to a state of perpetual maneuver. And his end was sadly fitting for a man who spent his life running from his balance sheet.
Daniel Defoe died on the 24th of April, 1731, in Ropemaker's Alley, London, not far from where he was born. The sources strongly suggest he was hiding from creditors at the time of his death.
The ultimate fate he had spent decades trying to avoid finally caught up with him. The official cause of death was listed as lethargy, though it was likely a stroke. He was interred in Bunhill Fields, a cemetery just outside the medieval boundaries of the City of London, a final gesture fitting for a lifelong dissenter who operated just outside the establishment.
He was a failed businessman, a pardoned rebel, a brilliant intelligence agent who undermined an entire national union, a pioneering journalist and a master satirist who stood in the pillory for his art.
And out of that instability, that constant need to observe society truthfully enough to convince his handlers, to lie convincingly enough to sell a fictional memoir, and to write anonymously to survive politically, came the narrative realism that defined the modern novel.
His life as a political and social observer, always maneuvering between factions and classes, forced him to adopt the nuanced, often immoral, pragmatic perspective of his characters, Moll Flanders, Roxana, Colonel Jack. Their narratives are all defined by a practical striving that mirrors his own lifelong struggle to maintain his status and avoid the ultimate humiliation of the debtor's prison.
The ability to write compelling fiction requires profound empathy and insight into motivation. But Defoe had more than empathy. He had operational experience. He knew exactly what motivated people to cheat, to survive, and to reinvent themselves because he had to do it nearly 200 times.
So here's the final provocative thought for you to consider. What unique, perhaps cynical, perspective did Defoe gain about the true nature of human motivation by constantly having to reinvent himself, adopting nearly 200 different disguises and identities just to survive the vicious political and financial landscape of early 18th century England? Did his requirement for political and financial survival essentially force him to become the world's first truly realistic novelist?